forgive me for just being a little late. The media is all over me all day, every day, since this case started in the latest round when they made the arrest. And I lost my voice. Literally wall-to-wall media. I don't think I've drafted 3 new legal papers in 3 weeks. But that's how crazy it is. And they want me tomorrow and the next day and so forth. So it's become probably a story that's of historical proportions. And so you're a part of the history by coming tonight, I think, being in it. So I appreciate that you showed up. Very kind, very nice. I don't know where to begin. I did this once before at the Smithtown Library. I don't think they had as many, I think the room was smaller, but they had a lot of people there too. So I don't want to just repeat myself because I think that's streaming, I was told. And that's a little difficult because it's the same story. So if I do repeat myself and you've been there before or you've heard it before, nothing I can do. That's the best I can do. Mind if I move this up a little too? Good. Just a little better. All right. Well, I'm John Ray. I guess you know that. And I've been at this practice for 41 years, doing all kinds of cases, all kinds of lawsuits, litigations, criminal cases, family court cases, administrative cases, civil rights, federal, state. I've been in all these places and done all those kinds of things. And I'm on my 33rd homicide case, so where I've had either representing the victim or representing the accused, and I don't see it ending anytime soon. So this case, or these cases, I should say, the Gilgo Beach, Oak Beach cases, are part of that framework, so that when I came into it, I already had a pretty deep experience in law when I stepped into it in the first place. So I brought that to the table, as it were, when I began the case in December of 2011. And I think one of the first things to note is that because you see how I dress, I don't know how to match colors, I know that. And I get mixed up now and then, in the morning it's dark. And that's how I dress, and I always have, and I've always worn a hat. And I don't think that sat well with the police department when I first came into the case. They expect a gray-suited lawyer to be a lawyer, and I don't dress like that. So I think I created a sense of the notion that the man is frivolous, the man is not to be taken seriously. And that, I think, informed the relationship between myself and the Suffolk County Police Department higher-ups and I say higher-ups, not the whole police force. When I first came in for Shannan Gilbert, I wore some fancy clothes at the first press conference, and that was remarked upon by them. So I don't know why they didn't know they should have taken me seriously. We had already had many, many cases that, criminal cases especially, that where I cross-examined a lot of their detectives. So I think they should have paid better attention. They didn't, and that became a big problem from the start. So that's where I start tonight, from that moment, with that atmosphere. That's what brought us here eventually, okay? And here's what I mean. There was a Medford murder, if you remember it, the Medford pharmacy back then, and the man, he assassinated 5 people with a pistol in the pharmacy, and his name was, try me with names I forgot, but anyway, I was retained to represent 2 of the victims of of this man. And she was a woman who was shot, and these were her 2 little children. So I came to the sentencing to speak on their behalf. And if any of you have ever been to a sentencing, seen it on TV, or participated in one yourself, you'll know something that's a little bit sad. And that is that at sentencings, people speak, victims come up and they speak about, the loved one they lost and so on. And invariably, I think, my experience, and I've seen so many of them, is that they don't speak well. They mean well. They intend to try to say something good, profound, and right. And the words cannot do that. I say they don't speak well, not because they don't know how to speak well, but rather because sometimes they do. And yet they say things that can never encompass what really happened. So when you say, well, he used to play cards with us on Friday nights, and he's full of fun and laughter, and things, how does that really even begin to remotely describe the pain, the suffering, the absolute horror of what was done to that person and what was done to that surviving family? It doesn't. And when sometimes you see him say, Mr. Jones, turn around and look at me. Look at my eyes. Look what you've done. Do you think that really advances justice? I don't think it's a good idea. So when I went to this sentencing, I had that dilemma. How do I come up and speak when I know that doesn't work well? And really, okay, the judge listens, everybody listens, it's nice, but the words are the symbols of meaning. Think about that. They're the symbols of meaning. So when you choose a word, you choose to express a meaning. And it's impossible, in my view, to express the meaning of murder and its consequences. That's why words are inadequate, no matter what you say. So it was very hard. And so what I did was I took on the personality of the little girls, and I spoke on their behalf as if I were them. And it worked as well as it could work. And so one of the reporters, there were a lot of reporters there, they were in the jury box watching the whole thing. From the Daily News, Steve Barcelo came over to me and said, I want to talk to you afterward. I did. He said, listen, I have this lady, Shannan Gilbert, who, if you've been watching TV, or I don't watch TV, but read the newspapers, I do. And he said, she needs your help. Can you meet with her? So we arranged it. We went to a bar in Iceland, and there I met Shannan Gilbert with Steve, and we became friendly right away. I understood her plight, and the reason she needed to meet me, she said, was because up until then, we know that the investigation of the Gilgo Beach murders had been going now for months, and it wasn't going well, especially for Shannan. Well, for all of them, but from Mary's point of view, especially for Shannan. And it was being bungled badly by the police department and the Newsday and Channel 12 and everybody. They were all over the police for their mistakes. And they bumbled into, I don't know what kind of an investigation that was going on. I didn't know much about it because all I did is, I said, I read, but I didn't spend much time reading deeply on it because it wasn't my case. And I'm a pretty busy lawyer. So I didn't know a lot about it, but I did know about the bungling. So I agreed. I said, I'll represent you, but for what? And she said, well, we want to bring in, can we ask that we get the federal authorities in this case because the county's blowing it. And I said, okay, what we'll do is we'll call a press conference at Oak Beach. Now this is in December, right, early January. And I will use the press conference to call for the United States Attorney, the Justice Department, to step in with the FBI and get involved in this investigation and at least work with Suffolk County, if not push them away. And I thought, well, how do we get the feds in? Well, let's see. These are wetlands, so there may be federal laws governing wetlands that give them jurisdiction to step in. Secondly, the girl who disappeared, Shannan Gilbert, had come from Jersey City, New Jersey. So she had crossed state lines that night to meet up with Mr. Brewer, the John, and that would mean federal intervention as well. And there might be some other areas, but those are the two I thought of at the moment. I said, yeah, let's do that. Let's call this press conference, see what happens. So I wrote a nice letter to the Justice Department asking them to intervene, brought the letter to the press conference, had a nice little poster set up about calling for federal intervention. We held the meeting in the cold parking lot near Oak Beach, and I did what I said. But with one trouble. I couldn't help myself for good reasons. I think you'll agree. I hope you will. I don't know that necessarily you're all on my team, so I don't know why I just said that. But in any event, and I couldn't help myself in one respect. And that was, I had to say something about the bumbling of the police department. Now, up until then, when the remains of the body had not yet been found a few days before, the jeans, pocketbook, cell phone, and a perfume cap for a bottle were found, and they were Shannon's, and they were found in a sort of a circular area on loam in the marsh, catty-corner behind Dr. Peter Hackett's home. And when those were found, the commissioner of police at the time made a speech in which he said that she had drowned, and they had not yet even found the body. It was an absurd point of view. It made no sense whatsoever, and it would give you some indication, say, wait a minute, that's what the police are saying. What in God's name are they doing? And when her bones were found, she was laying face up in an area where the water, if there was any at all, was no more than an inch or two, and with her head on a bush, face up. So how then could she have drowned? Well, immediately the police adjusted their story. And they said, well, because they were confronted with this question. And they said, she probably died of natural causes. All right? As in, she might have frozen to death or just, gave up because she couldn't get out of the marsh. That's what they said. Look it up. And, of course, that was equally ridiculous, or so it seemed to me. And now I'm stepping in on this press conference. So what do? I say, well, this is the investigation done by the Pink Panther, and this is Inspector Clouseau, the commissioner. So that was not a good move. I'm sorry. I think I overstepped. But so I did. And that did not sit well with certain police officers. I'm not talking about the rank and file. I'm talking about the uppers. And I was done. I finished my work, and on I was going to go. A few days later, however, James Burke gets appointed as the new chief of police. And I forget whether it was right before he got appointed in January or right after he got appointed, I'm not sure anymore. I receive a letter from the detective, Steffens, from the Homicide Bureau, working on the case of the killers in Oak Beach and Gilgo. And he is also the treasurer of the Police Detectives Union. And he writes me on a two-page single-spaced letter, and he writes it on stationery from the police union. not on police department stationery. I subsequently looked into Detective Steffen's background. He was a man of integrity. He was a man he was known to be a guy that toed the line, always did spoke the official language, and wasn't a guy to deviate or go off on his own. And here's a letter coming to me where he went off on his own, and he did it on Union stationery. You know, I guess that caused some thought, like, what's going on here? But what was more important than what I just told you was that the letter went and explicated on the details of what was contained on the 23-minute 911 call that Shannan Gilbert made that night, or that morning, that early morning hours. And it was surprising for this reason to me. Not what it said, which was also surprising, but rather, more importantly, that it was said at all. Because here is a police detective setting down evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation where they are very intent, the police department ordinarily, on not letting you know anything about what's going on. Much less that this is coming out of the mouth of a detective without the official rubber stamp of the police department on Union stationery. Well, that's strikingly odd that it would come that way, wouldn't you say? Yeah. And this is a guy who would never do that on his own. He would always do it with the approval of someone. That's the rep he had. And so what did it mean? Well, I guess you can get where I'm going. It meant that there was somebody in the background pulling the strings and telling him what to write in that letter, and that person had to be an official. To let the police department release evidence in detail about what occurred? Yeah, and I don't know to this day who it was, but I can smell Burke from 10 miles away in different ways, because he was at that time, he had been the chief of detectives for the district attorney's office. And those are police department members who are brought over and they become kind of like a private Praetorian guard for Thomas Spoda. And so they were detectives and they tend to be in competition with the police department they came from. But Burke was in charge of that operation. And he had the official blessing, right, of Thomas Spoda. It was Burke who was the de facto leader of that investigation from day one, I would put to you. All right? And now he was the official, de jure. He was in charge now of the investigation, in fact, in early 2012. That letter said the following. And of course, it's been published. You can read it in Newsday, or if you read the cases that come up in the, if you read you can go on NICEF and see it. It's in one of the exhibits. And that letter said, amongst other things, that at no time was there any trouble in that business when she called when she called 911 operator. There was no problem in Brew's house. Everybody was calm. He wrote, it's literal. I'm not interpreting. That's what he said. Everybody was calm. At no time was Shannan excited. At no time was anybody else excited. She was never under any threat, and there was no danger. That's what he said. And so I was all wet, he said. And he said, he kind of insulted me like, be a real professional. If you know the way we work, you'd know this, and you wouldn't open your mouth. It was that kind of a letter. Nicely spoken, but that's what it said. So those things were all false, as we now know. They're outright falsehoods. And nobody from the police department ever disciplined him for breaking ranks. Nobody from the police department ever denied that his letter was accurate, although the same police department was quite willing to hold a press conference to say that that fellow Bissett, the landscaper who committed suicide, was not a suspect. They were willing to do that and other things like that. But never did they once disrespect, disregard, or disown that letter. In other words, that was the official, unofficial, official position of the police department for the next 12 years. They laid it out. And to just make my point a little better, I didn't do this, he did. He took the letter and then mailed it to Newsday, and it was published as a featured letter in Newsday with big border around it. That was the way the police department operated. On a series of outright lies, they knew were lies, they had heard the tapes, they couldn't both be true. And I'm willing to bet that the tape is more accurate than what he said was on the tape. So that was the beginning. And so now I'm in Newsday being dissed through this letter. I'm being dissed privately by this guy. And I'm wondering what's going on that these kinds of unusual things would be said and done. And this is something that's a very bad idea, because I probably got it on a Friday night. And, you know, I'm Irish, so. and I got my Irish up, and I didn't like that. I wasn't happy. So I decided I would help out. I'd continue. So I went back to Mary, told her about what happened, and we continued. So I got into the case somewhat, you know, in the beginning. There was no lawsuit pending or anything. And the next thing I can recall was that sometime in the spring, after a series of letters we sent to the medical examiner, which is an independent civil office of the county, independent of the police department, in theory. After several, series of letters back and forth, the autopsy for Shannan was finally done or completed. And what is standard is when somebody dies and there's an autopsy, the medical examiner who did the work calls a meeting with the relatives, and they sit down and they talk about it. And they show you pictures or let you look at whatever there is, if you want to. And that's how families are treated, and rightfully so. And so that's what was supposed to happen here. So I went with the Gilbert family, as well as some staff members of mine, and we all went together to the meeting with the medical examiner, the ME. And that becomes very interesting as well, because it's very unusual what happens. Went into the meeting, and sitting across the table was the chief medical examiner, who did not do the work, and an assistant medical examiner who did. And she was brand new, very young, very inexperienced. And sitting behind her to her right, and facing us at a 90-degree angle, were 3 homicide detectives, all sitting with their arms crossed. Now that, anybody knows, that's usually a sign of hostility. Right? And she's got her arms crossed and she's smiling at her. Very hostile. I'm ready. Anyway, and so I went into this meeting. Now, I didn't know much about the case. There was very little that we knew factually, except what I just told you. And we sat there, and they presented us with their papers and agreed to answer questions. And then she read a statement of what she heard on the tape. She herself heard. And it was a single-spaced, very long statement she gave us. And she did not agree with Detective Stephan. Now, I hadn't heard the tape. I didn't know the tape. So now I had the assistant ME sitting there reading from a sheet and telling us that Shannan was excited. There was a scuffle. Wait a minute. What? Right? So every time I asked her any kind of a poignant question, a valuable question, and there weren't many, she would get out of her chair walk over to the homicide boys, whisper to them, they'd whisper back, she'd sit down and answer the question. The medical examiner's office was in complete thrall of the Suffolk County Police Department. Now, that is not right. There's something wrong with that. It should never have happened. They shouldn't have even been at the family meeting. You know, was I going to hit somebody? You know, why do we need those guys there? But they were there to protect. So I asked the ME, I said, "Doctor, would you kindly preserve your notes?" And she said no. She said, I'm not preserving my notes. I said, well, you have to. You're legally obligated to preserve your notes. So she got up, talked to them, came back, talked to the medical examiner, and said, okay, all right, we'll preserve the notes. She wasn't going to. If I hadn't asked, those notes would have been destroyed. Fast forward, I think they were destroyed. We never got them. We tried to get them. We couldn't. All right? But that actually occurred. Now, two other things happened at that meeting that are important in this whole thing. There was a list of items recovered from Shannan, or about Shannan, and there was a photograph on 8.5 by 11 on Xerox paper. Sorry about the old-fashioned word. Right? Was it right? I should say photocopies. I'm sorry. And on that photocopy was the picture of the bones as they were laid out on the operating table. No pictures of Shannan as she was found in the marsh. They had pictures with them, but none of those. We weren't allowed to see those, which is, again, what's wrong. The family's entitled to see it. And the little teeny-weeny picture that we did have of the bones had little diagrams of what each bone was at the bottom, a list. And, of course, there was the hyoid bone. And so I knew to look for that, because that's the bone that's a U-shaped bone. It's in your throat, and it's the only bone in your body that is not attached to any other bone. And that bone was always important in a strangulation, because whenever you strangulate somebody, most of the time the bone is fractured in some way. All right, people who are hung, that hyoid bone is broken. In about 95% of the women who were hung, right up until then, there was a big study done on it, the hyoid bone was broken. So, knowing that, there was the hyoid bone. It was about that big that you could see it in the picture they gave us. No pictures up close of anything. And next to that bone's notation, it said that the bone had an indent in it. An indent. It looked like it in the base of the bone. So if it's U-shaped, picture the base. Okay? An indent is what it was called. So I asked her, what's the indent? How did that get there? And she said, oh, it's probably animal. No. It was a growth, probably, that she had on her throat that grew into the bone. Of course, no evidence of that whatsoever. Okay? What do I know? Fine. So that was one significant thing. And the other one was that, and by the way, no fracture, nothing about a fracture. So at that point, I didn't think she was choked in any way. And then something else. They recovered her leather jacket that she wore that morning. We know she wore a leather jacket as well because her boyfriend, Alex Diaz, told me so. And the police had recovered it. So I said, can we please see the leather jacket? And she went over, talked to them, came back and said, it was lost. Okay? So I'd say check this all out. You can talk to some, if you want, to any of the police and see what they say about this, but that's what happened. So that was very curious too, because that would have been a key piece of evidence. When Shannan was in a struggle, there might be DNA, and you can test the DNA and so on. We were not allowed to get back any of her remains. We were not allowed to get back any of her items because the police apparently claimed that it was an open, active ongoing criminal investigation. Right? So when I asked her how did she die, what was the cause of death and the manner of death, if you ever look on a death certificate, you'll see that's what needs to be found by the ME. And she said it was undetermined. Okay, fair enough. It wasn't clear whether it was murder or not. There was circumstantial evidence, but that's different. Okay. Drug testing was done on her, the matting of hair that was left, slight matting of hair, and no drugs were found in the hair sample. The toxicology work was done by the New York City medical examiner, so I went to the city to get their records as well. And there was no drugs. And that's interesting because if she took drugs that evening, before she disappeared, the drugs would not have turned up in her hair. Wouldn't have had time to get there. But if she was a drug user who was, had a problem, it would have turned up in her hair, for sure. And there was none. Well, now we had some real serious questions about what really happened here with that in mind. You can well imagine. And so the case goes on. And finally, as I'm trying to get more evidence and fighting with the ME's office to get back the remains and so on, and the police continue to do the same, or fail to do the same work they should have done. We get to the year 2013, I think it was. Hurricane Sandy, 13, right? 12, was it 12? I forget, whichever it was. But you sure it was 12? Yeah, okay. So we get to that, and I'm in Denmark, and we're trying to decide what to do. And we've gotten a lot of evidence about this Dr. Peter Hackett, enough to say he's a chief suspect, so much so that he almost, certainly was involved in her passing. And I talked to Murray, long distance, and we said, let's bring a lawsuit and see, we'll throw many different causes of action into the suit, like lawyers do, and see which ones stick. Some of them will get dismissed, and we'll have to put up with that. But if even one sticks, we have an ability to go forward, to continue the investigation, to use my powers as a lawyer, my authority, to subpoena, to take depositions, and so forth, to demand records, bring on actions, things of that nature. That's what we decided to do. But it was Hurricane Sandy came, and the statute of limitations was running out during the storm. So I had, and by the way, to start the case, we had to start it with an estate being formed for Shannan in New Jersey, because she was from Jersey City. So her estate would have been there. And I had to get to New Jersey, get the estate formed like that, lickety-split, and then use that estate to bring a lawsuit in New York. So you start to get a feeling, hopefully from what I'm telling you, I hope I'm not boring you, but you start to get a feeling of how much work really is involved in this kind of work. How many technical things and legal things you got to do. It's huge. It's enormous. It's very challenging to meet deadlines like that. So when we finally made up our minds to do it, it was getting late, and we were going to go to New Jersey somehow, and then the storm hit, and I couldn't get home from Denmark. So, and I was lucky because I was with these really fancy, wealthy people who had a big castle, and I got to stay in the castle while the storm. So while you were all suffering, I was in a castle eating steak. So, just so you know. Anyway, I had a former student. I was a high school history teacher before I was a lawyer when I was a young man. And in Miller Place, as well as other schools, and then Miller Place and there. And one of my students from Miller Place High School had become a lawyer, and she was in Jersey City, where her practice was, just by sheer coincidence. And so I called her and said, her name is Frances Nicotra. And I called Frances and said, Frances, can you get us do you have any connections to get us a really quick estate formed? You've got to prepare a whole lawsuit. You've got to serve the survivors. You've got to get approval from the court. You've got to have a hearing. And you've got to do a lot of things to get finally the records. I didn't know if we were going to have enough time. So she said, well, not only could she help me, but she had certain connections with some of the clerks. She was good with all the clerks. She'd see what she could do, and she got the estate formed for me in Jersey City, New Jersey, with only, I think we had a day and a half left before the statute ran out. And amazing, right? And we're doing all this long distance with the storm and so on. And the castle helped out a lot. You know, it was fun to stay there. Anyway, then we were able to get it served on. We filed it in State Supreme in Suffolk County. We got it served on the doctor, and that case is alive as we speak, and it's still ongoing. All right. So that was the case that enabled us to continue the pressure on the police department to do this right and get this right and get to the right conclusions. And so it began from there, the lawsuit aspect. During that lawsuit, we took the depositions of several people, Dr. Hackett, his wife, his children, neighbors who were involved in this. I took all of their depositions. Last count, we were up to 20 different depositions. And you know what a deposition, if any of you have been through it. If you have, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. They last anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, sometimes longer. Dr. Hackett's I took 3 times. And you saw one of them on TV when he had a heart attack and fell down, then jumped up and got in his car and drove away. All right? That was at my deposition, one of my depositions. So that was a challenge as well, to go through doing all of those and getting the evidence together that I needed to do. One of the things that was outstanding during the litigation was that, outstanding to me, was that when I would ask these people things about what happened that morning, you know, they would give whatever answer they gave. But when I asked them, did the police ever ask you that? These are the answers I would receive in almost every case. The police never called me. The police never talked to me. This is the first time they were talking. And these were material witnesses to what happened. The police didn't bother them. In one case, the police, one witness, the police, an important witness, the police interviewed him once, the missing persons police, and then once the homicide police for a few minutes, and that was it. And he was a key witness. Members of Peter Hackett's family were not interviewed by the police. Other people involved in the case were never interviewed by the police. And that was passing strange to me. So I proceeded with the continuation of the litigation till we get to the year 2016. And by then, of course, I was in a struggle to try to get the tapes, the 23-minute tapes. I had to sue the county, the police department, separately. Another lawsuit was brought. First in Article 78, which is a special proceeding you bring to get a judge to use the old writs that came down from England and get a writ of mandamus where it says, mandamus means we ordered you, and it would have a judge say to the county, we order you to give up the tape. So we went in with an Article 78, we lost, because it was deemed that it was an improper method of going forward. And instead, we learned that you had to subpoena the records and then sue them on the failure to obey the subpoena. So after we lost the Article 78, we started all over again, and that's what we did. While all that was going on, I was taking the depositions of the people I said. We weren't, inactive. And then I located an old friend of mine. And, well, we were acquaintances, maybe not a friend. And that was Dr. Michael Bodden. Dr. Michael Bodden is the most renowned medical examiner, bar none, in the world. And he had his, not his exact start, but in his early career, for 2 years, he was the medical examiner in Suffolk County, New York. So, you know, he had some familiarity with the territory. And he had done, just to give you a quick taste, he had done the Kennedy investigation, whether one bullet or more than one bullet killed John F. Kennedy. It was Michael Bodden who did that work as a medical examiner. There are many others. I'm not here to give you his resume, but the Ferguson killing out in Missouri when they had big riots and all, he did the autopsy in that case as well. And he's done many others. So that'll give you a taste of how important and what kind of stature Michael had. I knew him through another source, which was very fortunate. You know, it's Irish luck. And that was that he had a brother who worked with him in the business of dissection. His brother's name was Bobby. Bobby was kind of an old hippie with hair down to his butt, and really great guy, big mustache, you know. And it turned out Bobby and I, you look at this little man here, Bobby and I had played semi-professional football in the same league against one another back in the days of the Long Island Giants. I was on the Long Island Giants. And I used to be 210 pounds, and I lifted weights. So I was still too small, and I didn't last that long, about 2 years, and that was it. But we knew each other. So I was able to get Michael, had a meeting with him in New York, to do the autopsy again pro bono, which was really wonderful. And he stepped in, and now I had to get the bones. So I had sued the ME, and finally they released me the bones on the condition that I could have the bones placed to do the autopsy in a facility, a proper facility for that. Okay. So we were able to convince a very lovely funeral home in Rockville Center that had a big morgue to allow us to use their place for a reduced fee. And we did that. So we brought the bones there. We even had a fight to get them in an official car and bring them over. And we did the autopsy, which was just really laying out all the bones to see what was there and what was what. And one of the things we noticed is that I think it was the left hand, the fingers were missing. All these fingers were missing. And I had, by the way, asked BME, why are those fingers missing? And she said, animals took them. Which may be, I don't know. It's hard to know how that works. But little animals took them. But the hyoid bone was right in place. No little animals took that bone. And it's a tiny little bone. When we found the hyoid bone, one of the horns, of the two horns on one side, was all roughed up and fractured. That was never mentioned in the report. And the indent I looked for was not there. Instead, it was a hole that went directly through the base, almost like it was either drilled or punched, and very unlikely that an animal would just eat right through the bone like that in a circular fashion. So there it was. And that's what we found. So Michael said right away, that's a fracture, that she's been strangled. Right? That was all kept from us until then. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? And that bone, by the way, also had on it, on each tip of each horn, were little horns that grew outward from the two horns, little tiny horns. They were both missing. But the hyoid bone was in place where it was found. So it was hard to know what really happened, except this fracture tells you a lot. You know, I later on thought, was she tortured? Was something done to drive something through her throat? I don't know. With that hole, I don't know. I have no idea to this day. But there it is. Vastly different, important thing. So Michael called his own press conference to announce his findings, and I separately called one within the day of each other, and it caused a huge ruckus, as you can imagine. When it did that, I received a phone call either Thursday or Friday night from Detective Kevin Byra, who was the head of the homicide detectives at that point. And he said, let's work together. pretty shocking for the police, right? So I was quite flattered. I said, sure, be glad to, and no hard feelings about the past. And I always respected police officers. I still do. I've cross-examined many detectives, fine, brave men. So I have nothing against detectives. I just, we had this case, so let's move on and let's work together. Great. He called me at home. He said he'd call the following week. He never did. He didn't call. I called him back 2 or 3 times, and he never returned my calls. And I never heard from him again until recently. So this is the whole story that I started the theme with, and now you see why I started that way. This is the way it all went. They don't have any duty to cooperate with me. I'm a private citizen. I get that. But I do have some authority, and I do have a lot of evidence. So once I had gathered up all of the testimonies so far, and I had taken affidavits from Mrs. Brennan, whose door Shannan had knocked on, I went to Sweden. We have a home over in Sweden. I went to Sweden, and I sat at my table, brought a big boxes of documents with me, and we put together I put together a binder of all of the summaries of the evidence that I up until then had. And of course they were very detailed, line by line, item by item, explanations, analysis, explanation, and then conclusion on each line throughout these 17 depositions, showing that the lies that were told, contrasting one testimony with another. And you can imagine how much work that was. I just sat in Sweden and did it 12, 14, 15-hour days over and over until I finally got it. Put it together in a binder, and with photographs and the other evidence we had, brought it home, and I had, at that time, an ex-homicide detective from Suffolk County working with me on investigation, and I asked him to go and deliver this to the police department, offer it to them. And he did. And Detective Pat Portella, a gentleman in charge of the homicide investigation at that point, the detective sergeant, I believe he was, took the documents, called my investigator, and said to him, come get them. We don't want them. And after all that work, right? And he did, and when he came to get them, they were delivered into his hands by Detective Portella, and Portella said to him, John Ray will get those tapes over my dead body. That's what he said. And he also said that if Bissett has anything to do with this case, I will give you my house. That's what he said. And we know that the police had already called the press conference to say Bissett wasn't in it. That turns out not to be exactly right either. Bissett had something to do with Oak Beach. I don't know more than that. But it's not like he was just, like, how many of you have anything to do with Oak Beach? Maybe one, right? Right? Kind of interesting. Other than the OBI, when you smoke pot, Right. Yeah, it was a party animal place. That's what it was. The whole village there. I think that's what they were, but I don't know. Anyway, so now I forgot where I was. You know, it was a good. In Sweden, I was in Sweden. I come back. Anyway, that's what they say about the evidence that we're going to present. Okay, and it stayed that way and continued that way for years. As we get closer to now. And I didn't give up on getting the evidence. We found more and more evidence, and I'm going to tell you some new evidence that you never heard before tonight. So if you've fallen asleep about anything else, wait for that, because it's coming.
Can you just go back to Bissett? Yeah. That's where you Bissett.
Oh, Bissett. Yeah. Okay, I'll do the Bissett thing. You like that?
I don't know about that.
All right. Well, Bissett was a landscaping wholesaler, Bissett Landscaping, and they had two big centers of landscaping here on Long Island in Suffolk County. I believe one of them was Medford, and the other one I think was Deer Park. What was it?
Deer Park.
Deer Park.
Yeah, Deer Park area, yeah, okay. So a lot of you know, by the way, I know you know a lot about this already, most of you, I get it. So you're fact-checking me as I go along, I know that. You're like little computers sitting there, you know. Anyway, so that's who he was, and that's important to note, because aside from the rumors that you have and all the, you know, which rumors sometimes are true, that's why they're rumors very often, was that, you know, he was a party animal, always in a limo with the ladies, and he once had a boat, which he did, and the Wet and Wild Girls, as they were called, were on that boat. They would go out and party, and that was his rep. And then he would go to this bar in Route 110, what was it called? Not Nichols. What is it called? Gossips, thank you. So we have a pothead, and we have a dancer. Please forgive me. Anyway, and so he had committed suicide allegedly after two detectives had visited him about the case. I don't know if that's true or not. But then the police exonerated him. Said, nah, all the internet that went crazy because there were burlaps. We knew about the burlap sacks covering the girls. And, oh, landscaper does burlap, must be him. Okay? That was the thinking, and the internet went haywire. And that's when the cops said, look, enough. And they called a press conference. Very unusual. All right. However, in my investigation, during the investigation, I get to talk to Mrs. Brennan and the people who are in that little community who all live right next to each other, sort of, more or less. The community is one thing, you know, Oak Beach proper. Then there's an Oak Beach Association, the homeowners association, where this all happens. And within the association, there's a group of houses that are right near each other, apart from all the others. And that's where Hackett was, and Gus Coletti, the door that she knocked on, Barbara Brennan. And it turned out, next door to Barbara Brennan's house was the house of a guy named Sal Aversano. And Sal had a son who was the best friend of Peter Hackett's son and the best friend of Thomas Canning's son. Thomas Canning lived across the street from Mrs. Brennan. And so they were all very tightly knit, the three kids. The young Aversano boy died of an overdose, and the son of Canning, Justin, was busted in a heroin bust in New Jersey. So this was the culture that they were living in. But what's interesting is, why I point out Aversano, is that I take the deposition of Thomas Canning. And I met him first, talked to him at great length. He came, sat in my car, became friendly with the guy. I try to be friendly with all these people, why not? And I got to know him, and I got to know a lot of what he was going to say. And we were buddies, more or less. And when he testified, on his own, without my question, he blurted out at one point that he was really ticked off at Bissett. Why? Because Canning was a landscaper, retail level landscaper who did work door to door. And his practice, if you could call it that, his business, was limited to Oak Beach. So it was very important to him that he had the business in that community. And oddly enough, Bissett himself personally serviced Aversano's yard and gave him all the landscaping. And this ticked off Canning. I didn't ask him this. I had no idea this was true until he said it. And he said he was mad because he bought his wholesale goods from Bissett. He had to go on an interview with Bissett, had to, he interviewed the contractors to give them 30-day terms, that sort of thing. And he did that, he was successful. And here is Bissett directly competing. When did you ever hear of a wholesaler directly competing with the retailers that he services? It's just unheard of. And that's what happened. And so he was very angry at Bissett. He managed to tell me that. So here I'm saying, wait a minute, of all the communities that on Long Island and that are serviced by land wholesalers, this guy chooses the only place right smack dab in the center of the controversy where he's servicing the customer's home. That was a little surprising to me, which meant to me that he had some connections with Oak Beach, with that particular group in Oak Beach as well. More than that, I don't know, except that I also, it's a crazy world, isn't it? And it's so full of coincidences, and I don't know which ones are coincidences and which ones aren't sometimes. But all the people paying attention to this case heard once early on that a girl disappeared, a young girl disappeared in a cream-colored SUV or 4x4 and was unfound for 5 days. And immediately everybody went haywire on the computers again, on the internet, because Dr. Peter Hackett was driving that kind of a vehicle. He had received it from a man who had died in the community, and he had been at his deathbed servicing him when he died. So he got got a lot of things, and he got the guy's vehicle as well. And so everybody went crazy and said, we got him now. And 5 days later, the girl emerged. And she said, I don't know what you're all talking about. I didn't go with Peter Hackett. I don't know who he is. But, you're wrong. I was with my boyfriend. And the girl turned out to be somebody who I knew. So I called her up because I had been her lawyer years before. And I call her up and I say to her, so-and-so, what are you doing? What's going on? What happened? And I had been, in a very bitter custody battle on her behalf years before. And I had actually been her mother's lawyer even before that when she was a little girl. What are you doing? And she tells me, she said, no, I was with my boyfriend. That's all. I didn't disappear. Maybe people didn't know where I was, but that's where I was. And she says, but I do happen to know Shannan Gilbert. And I know Shannan because I met her in it was either the Garden City Hotel or the Marriott, I can't remember, over there in Nassau County. And and she said, and we became friends. And Shannan was trying to break into the rich man's market on the east end of Long Island. That's what she was trying to do. And only weeks before she died, she had been in communication with this girl. So, great news for me. So I'm asking her more. And if I find out that she mentioned that Shannan had a good client out in, I forget, Acklebog or Amagansett, I can't remember, but where Bissett lived out east. And she said, I said, the name's familiar, Bissett? She thought it was. So it may be that Shannan had been servicing Bissett, which makes it even more interesting, doesn't it? All right? That girl was never once interviewed by the police department to this day. And she wasn't willing to share with me. She said she was willing to share with me, but never did, her emails back and forth with Shannan. So that's where it stands. But it makes it more interesting. You can see there's much more evidence that's out there waiting to be turned over and looked at. And it's not necessarily for me to do that, actually. It's for the police to do that. But they never did. So, moving on. You asked about Bissett. That's your answer. Does that help? All right. Finally, I get the tapes. And only because the judge listens to my argument that what Detective Portella put in was self-contradictory. I made a motion for the tapes, they denied it, and they said, we can't give up these tapes because it's an ongoing, active criminal investigation. So we can't do that. We can't give up evidence. And I pointed out, and he said that under oath, and I pointed out, I said, wait a minute. They already revealed what was on the tapes. They themselves gave it up back in the day of Detective Stephan. So how can they say this? It's contradictory. And more importantly, if it's an ongoing criminal investigation, why are they also saying, by public announcement, that Shannan died of an unfortunate, very likely, natural causes, and did not die criminally? In which event, because she didn't die criminally, they didn't have to investigate. It wasn't a crime. And then in the same breath, it was a crime. And they were taking those positions. That's why I eventually won, amongst other reasons. So what did they do? You would think, okay, fair and square, they'll give up the, And I might just digress before I tell you what happens next. Think about this. This case is now pending at that point for what? 7 years, something like that, 8 years, whatever. And nothing has been accomplished. Nothing has been done. Did it not occur to the police department to do what you've seen police departments do all across the country? All you people who watch criminal shows, right? Most of you here, no doubt, right? That's a very popular thing. It's the most popular subject matter in television today. And that is, let the public in on it, put some evidence out there, and let's see what comes back. Right? And they weren't doing that. Why not? Very, very concerning, very troubling. So we fought it out, and finally I get the tapes, I win. But what do they do next? They appeal it. And when they appeal it, the government automatically gets a stay. They get an injunction. You can't go any further until the appeal is used up. And appeals take 1.5 years. They can be 2 years long. So they knew it. And what they were doing was they were trying to kill this by making it into a cold case. Witnesses die off, things disappear, evidence goes away. That's what happens in time. And sure enough, in our case, people were dying off. Gus Coletti died. Right? There were others. Bissett died. So I guess they were waiting for John Ray to die. I don't know. They got to wait a little longer. And that was their posture. They appealed it and slowed down the whole thing. I won the appeal, but the irony was I get the tapes, and I'll tell you how that came in a moment. I get the tapes, finally, but the judge puts a restriction on me and says you can't use them. You can't put them out to the public. You have very narrow control over the tapes. So I could hear them, and if you said to me what's on them, I could go, and I couldn't say. So here I am tied with that, all right? But back to the tapes. I think you'll enjoy this one. They were delivered to my office. I think it was on a weekend. And the detective who knocked on the door at my office when nobody would have been there was Detective Pat Portella. And, but I had somebody nearby who saw him at the door. I guess he thought he was just going to leave him there, and called me at my home, and I zoomed over, and I was there in about I went about 80 miles an hour. And I got there, I was there in about maybe 5 minutes. I don't think he expected that. And as he's walking down the steps, the platform there, hey, hello, detective. And I said, I see you're still alive. And he did not get the joke. So I invited him in, we talked, and we had a nice arm's length conversation. And he wished me good luck with my case, which was said with this just ever such a touch of irony. And I thanked, and he went on his way. So we had the tapes now, and we listened to them. Now, you've all heard them by now. And that's only happened because the police just wouldn't give up what they were doing, and I was able, in some ways, to talk about what was on the tapes from a negative aspect without revealing directly what was on the tapes. So that began to do some undermining of their posture. And then Rodney Harrison gets appointed as a new commissioner. And when he does, a little over a year ago, right? One of the first things he does, former New York City detective, real straight guy, real good guy, I get good vibes from him right away from people I know in New York City Police Department who told me about him and said, yep, he's a good guy. Stick with him. And one of the first things he does when he gets in office is he says, we're going to have transparency on the Gilgo Beach, Oak Beach situation. Transparency. And he calls me and says, can I come and meet with you? So I said, great, that was really a great step, And he did, he showed up. And he showed up with Detective Byron in tow and various other detectives at my office. And sitting in the chairs they were to my right, we talked, and he said, I'm going to be transparent. He got himself kind of worked up about that. And finally he stood up and he said, and you know what? We're going to release the tapes. And with that, I saw the faces of the other detectives. It was like they had just been buried alive. And shaking their head. And that's what he said, we're going to do it. So great, now I can use them. If they release them, they don't care anymore. I can use them. Right? I don't have to use the tape I have. I could use the tape that they release. And that's the way it went. But that becomes a problem too last May, which I'll come back to in a moment. Right? However, on the tapes themselves, when I got them, I was entitled to also get the transcripts, any transcripts that the police had made of the tapes, and I was entitled to also get any voice enhancements or anything like they had done with the tape scientifically. It was part of my application. I won. I was entitled to those. When Detective Portella came, he had the tapes in a nice little package with none of those other things. None. So I said to him nicely, Detective, where are these other things? I'm entitled to them. And here's what he said. He said, we never made a transcript of the tapes. The only transcript the police were relying on in the whole motion practice was the one that I eventually had made. That was it. And that was used later on because he didn't have it at that point. Nobody had a transcript of the tapes. And I said to him, well, did you make a voice enhancement? No. And I said, well, do you have am I getting the original tape? All this is taking place, the two of us alone, in my office. And he said, no, it's not an original. So I said, is it a copy? He said, no. So well, where's the original? He said, we never had the original. So they fought me in court for how many years? And in an appeal? And continuously represented that they weren't giving up the tape. And they never had it in the first place. Complete, disgraceful misrepresentation to a court of law was done. That's how far they were willing to go. You have to wonder why. That happened. So I said, okay, well, how did you get the tape then? He said the state police department had it. And they made a copy of it for the Suffolk County Police, and Suffolk County Police made a copy of the copy. The reason the state police had it was that when Shannan called in, the 911 phone rang in Suffolk County, and then they transferred it, Suffolk County, to the state police because it was, in the area of Jones Beach. They thought it was a state call. So the state police had it all along. And when I had requested it originally from the state police because I suspected that they had a copy of it, they refused to give it to me as well because they said we are under the direction of the Suffolk County Police. We will not do what they will not do. So when I now went back to them to get the tape the original, to see if anything had been altered, erased, whatever. They no longer had it, and they don't know where it is. So that's what happened. You know, I guess you could say, could he make this up? Yeah, he's pretty clever. He might be able to make it up. But that's what happened. You know, that's what really happened. So I had the copy of a copy, and you heard a copy of a copy when you heard the tape that finally Rodney played. Rodney and I became friends. He was coming to one of my lacrosse games. I still play lacrosse. And he was coming to one of my lacrosse games. We became good buddies. And he's a good guy. A straight shooter. And he was having real trouble breaking through the crust of the old bureaucracy of the Suffolk County Police Department. And I have great faith that he'll continue to do well with that. But something went wrong again. That was in February when he came to my office. In May 13th, Friday the 13th of last year, the police department announced that they were holding a press conference at the auditorium in Suffolk Community College in Brentwood. And big auditorium. Press only. And they were going to then release the tapes and discuss them. That's what they told the public. So I went to the college anyway, and I stood outside with State Senator Phil Boyle, who was interested in this. He was there with me. We sat together and listened to the presentation on his cell phone while we were outside. And what happened at that meeting is fascinating, because while that meeting was going on, Rodney released the entire 23-minute tape of Shannan Gilbert. And it was put on some obscure site that the police had created, very hard to find for the average person, and it was played unexpurgated on that site. But the press wasn't listening to it, because the press had been invited to this meeting where they thought they were going to get the whole thing and they were going to get an explanation. Instead, so the press only reported what the police told them. Instead, Detective Byra conducted a presentation with slides on a big screen, which we couldn't see, right? We were on the computer, on the cell phone. And he explained his way through it. A total of about 3.5, if you listen to it, you can still hear it, 3.5 to 4 minutes or so of the 23-minute tape was played by Lieutenant Byra with pictures to explain their theory. And what was their theory now? Their theory was Shannan died of an unfortunate, tragic accident. That was their theory. It was the same theory all the way back to Stephen. Right? And he showed why that was true. And the first two slides, or early slides that he showed, were the slides of the marsh, because the police said, didn't they? You all know this. The police said she was on drugs, she was confused, she was delusional, she ran into the dark marsh, got lost, panicked, and died. Somehow. No more drowning. Somehow. Before I go further, just so you know, they could have conducted a drowning test on the bones. It's called the diatomaceous test or something like that. And it's expensive. They didn't do it. So the drowning was out. It was just an unfortunate, tragic accident, said the detective. And folks, I have great regard for, as I told you, for the police as a rule. And detectives, especially in homicide, they're the creme de la creme. They're very brave men usually, and women. And they are fearless. I've taken the Suffolk County detectives' testimony in murder cases. I've been the defendant's lawyer, where I heard things on the stand that they did that was absolutely stunning. So I had a lot of regard for them, and I still do. So, with that regard in mind, I know that homicide detectives, of all the detectives, are very much completely immersed in evidence. Evidence. They need evidence because it's their job to convict the guy they accuse. And if they don't have enough evidence to do that, a murderer is going to walk. So they have to be sure that they really understand and grasp the notion and the concept and the value of evidence. Right? Makes perfect sense. True? Yeah. And in this instance, here is the chief of detectives of homicide saying that this young lady dies of an unfortunate, tragic accident without explaining what the accident was, because there was none, without a scintilla of evidence that she died by accident. Not a scintilla. In other words, they drew a conclusion without evidence. When have you ever heard of that? It completely destroys, they managed to do that last May, destroys any possibility that any reasonable person can rely on their word when that happened. And just to make matters worse, so you understand it, the photographs they were using were fake. In 2 instances that I know of. One of the very experienced reporters, he was actually a cameraman from one of the organizations that was there, left early because he was offended. And he waited till I finished talking, and then he left. He didn't stay around for the coffee and such. And he came out to me, and an old friend of mine from all these years of doing work on, I had a lot of high-profile cases, so I knew them all. And he came out to me and he said, John, you got to see these slides. He said, they're fake. He said, what they did is, he's a cameraman, he said, they closed down the aperture on the camera and focused it on the reeds. And if you put the light on the reeds with the closed aperture, behind the reeds is pitch blackness. Right? And he knew that was false. Why? Because this was the guy who walked with me in the marsh. When I walked in the marsh in 2012 to see whether Shannan really could have died in the way it was said. This guy went with me through the whole thing. So he knows what we know. And we know that Shannan could not have gotten into that marsh earlier, if she ever got in there at all, which is speculation, earlier than when she had knocked on Barbara Brennan's door and then had left Barbara Brennan's house and walked all the way to the marsh, or ran, and then somehow found her way in. That meant, just by using simple clock, that she couldn't have gotten there until about somewhere between 6:20 and 6:30, 6:35. The sun was up in 10 more minutes after that. You just look at your charts for weather and for climate and so on. And it was twilight when she would have entered the marsh, if that was true. Twilight is not darkness. Right? She would have been in the beginning of the marsh by the time she found her way in. Let's say it was now 7 o'clock. The sun was up. Barbara Brennan testified to me and signed a sworn statement that the lights had already gone off, the evening lights on the overhead light, the lampposts, and on her home, because it was already light when Shannan was knocking. And the police know this. These guys deal with evidence. They know that, and they put up 2 slides to pretend it was pitch black when Shannan got lost in the marsh to support their narrative. And it was hogwash. Complete fake. And this guy got so annoyed because he was there, he came out to tell me so. And he said, just watch for the rest, watch what you're going to hear. And sure enough, what do we hear? She was disoriented, she was clearly on drugs, and she wandered off into the marsh, irrationally acting all through this thing, and ended up dead. We don't know how, but she wasn't murdered. That, against all the evidence that we know, I haven't even gone into a drop of it compared to what I have, including Dr. Biden's testimony about the hyoid bone, and including Shannan's own outcries on the tape, where the very first thing she says, someone is after me, someone is after me. That's why she called. And then she says, they're going to kill me, they are going to kill me, they are going to kill me. And then you hear her running, You hear a struggle, you hear her running, then you hear another struggle and blood-curdling scream, and then a run. She got away. Maybe because they grabbed her and the coat came off and she kept going. But all that evidence, and the police make this conclusion. Something is really wrong with this whole situation, this whole investigation, on its face. Something is really wrong for them to say that. So I did walk the marsh in May of 2012. We went in the same week that Shannan would have been in the marsh, early May. May 1st she went in, if she went in at all, if you believe the police. And so we tried to replicate the conditions. We waited until the weather it was when she would have gone in if she did. And I brought along a lady who was approximately Shannan's height, size, and weight. And we went and bought Army-Navy fatigues from the Vietnam War in an Army-Navy store. And we put on iridescent boots so we wouldn't get lost. We bought ropes. And why do we do all that? Because the police commissioner had said it was a terrible marsh. And he's an Irishman, And so, and he said that it was filled with, animals, that, bad animals, like rats and so on, I guess. And it was filled with sticker bushes and the like. And so it was dangerous, and it even has, quicksand. So, we came prepared. And then we tried to get in. And almost anywhere you went, I should rather take that back, anywhere you went, to get into that marsh was not well nigh impossible without a lot of work. So a girl who's running for her life would just leap over all this and jump into the marsh. The marsh was thick with sticker bushes and reeds and all kinds of plants. And the police apparently claimed to Barcelo that she went in a house right next door to Hackett's. And there was a way you could get in the marsh there if you worked your way. You had to work it, but you could get in. That's how we got in. Once you were in, the sticker bushes diminished or disappeared completely, and there was just reeds. So at any point in that marsh, when we walked and we found where the items were that she had left behind, allegedly, because there was still the flags there, you could see. And then we went from there and we found our way to where her bones were, because there were crosses that had come in from the parkway and put up crosses, and we found our way there. We always made sure we walked through the highest reeds so we would replicate what Shannan might have experienced if she was there. And at any time we did that, to the north, you could hear the sound of tires going on the roadway, and you could see lights. To the south, you could see the houses, and in some cases you could see right into the window people sitting there drinking their morning coffee. And this made Shannan despair. So she just dropped down and died. It's an absurdity. It's an absurdity. Anybody that actually went and did what we did. And we noted the light, and at no time was it pitch dark. And it became very bright by the time we got to where she was. And we were equipped. There were mosquito canals, narrow canals, only about this deep, and 2 feet, maybe, and with boards over them in various places where people would go in, I guess, kids, hunters, whatever. And so it wasn't like an uninhabited place. People used it. And side point, if you're thinking about, well, how did they get the body over to where it was finally found, far down to the east? How did it get there? She was light and thin and small. A big man could carry her. Or big men, or a man and a woman, or you could go in a skiff in the mosquito canal and just pull the skiff. Several years later, I've been back in the marsh about 4 times now for various reasons. And those sticker bushes were pretty rough. So rough that even in my pants, they didn't fall off. My pants managed to stay on. And I tell you that, some of you are laughing because you know where I'm going. The police claimed that Shannan Gilbert's jeans, this is a sex worker, she wears baggy jeans? I don't think so. That the jeans came off as she ran, and the sticker bushes pulled them off. That's what the police said. You can't make this up, I can't. Interesting side note, before I forget, I do a lot of side notes. When the items were found, her pocketbook was found. Coletti, who I befriended and met him that very morning I walked at Marsh, I talked to him on his deck and he told me a story of what happened. Then he told me another story later on that contradicted the first one. And then he told the press 2 more stories that contradicted all of them. Right? Gus Coletti claimed that he had a pretty clear vision of Shannan on the deck when she knocked on his door, and he did not see her carrying a pocketbook. That would make a lot of sense if she bolted out of the house. There's women go, oops, wait a minute, while I'm running away from my life, let me grab gotta get my perfume, my makeup, and bring it with me. And you don't hear a jingling of a pocketbook or a rubbing as she's running when you listen to the tape. Barbara Brennan had a clear vision of Shannan through her oval window on her kitchen door, which was kind of like the front door for her house, because she faces the water, and this was the door on the other side. And that's the door Shannan was trying to get in. You hear a bam, 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 bam. When Brennan calls 911, you hear Brennan's 911 call, and you hear the knocking from Shannan. And Brennan said she was trying to actually break into the house. She was that desperate. And while she was doing that, Brennan came to the window and saw her very clearly and was able to give me a very clear description of her white blouse, her jeans, and so on. And she did not have a pocketbook. She didn't see one. Or maybe she put it down, I don't know. But the pocketbook is found in the marsh with the jeans. The same pocketbook that was missing. A fact that might mean nothing except that they didn't observe it, it was really there, or it might mean something worse. And that would be something that you would think the people who love evidence would have been concerned about. You've heard nothing of that. That's what happened. So, like I said, a side note. Okay, so next thing happens. Shannan's running. You all know that. You've heard the tape. And the very first thing, if you listen carefully to the tape, and now I don't know how much time I have left.
20 minutes.
20 minutes, so we can do it. All right. You can stay for another 8 if you want. But now I'm going to ask you to focus, and if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to the tape again. Don't listen to the police version, which is truncated. Listen to the entire 23-minute tape. Okay? You can do it. And then try to enhance the sound on your own equipment, because that's very important. So I'm going to concentrate now on that tape for you. And I'm going to tell you something tonight that has not been said before. So you go home with something of value. When the call first goes in, there's nobody in the vicinity of that call when you listen to the call itself. Brewer is not there, or if he is, he's completely silent. And Pack is not there, he's still outside. Now, I've taken Brewer's testimony, and I've taken Pack's testimony, and there's many things that don't match. Many things. When you hear Brewer say he passed the lie detector test, that turns out not to be quite right. It was a neutral result. When Pack says he passed the lie detector test with flying colors, that's not accurate. He fell asleep during the first lie detector test. A man who was being tested about murder fell asleep. So we wonder how much testing really took place and how many questions were really asked in the early parts of this investigation. So you hear Shannan, and the first thing you hear is Shannan barely able to be heard. And right away, the police jump on it and say, ha, see that? She's on drugs. She's slurring her words. You can't, she's speaking in a bad way. Well, first of all, you got to know Shannan's voice to know if that's really true. I don't know her voice, but I do know her family's voice because I represent the whole family. And you know, if you have listened, I represented when Mary was finally killed by her daughter Sarah, because Sarah had lost her mind in great part because of the loss of her beloved sister who she worshipped. I represented Sarah in the murder case against her to try to prove her insanity. We lost. The jury was outraged by what had happened. I won't tell you, it's horrible. And then I appealed it. All pro bono. I represented her in her appeal. We lost the appeal for the same reason. And I still represent the whole family. So I know how they sound. And Sarah's voice is the closest to Shannan's. And she speaks the same way. You know, kids, right? What'd you say? That's how she sounds. And she may have had something to drink. She may have had a drug. Who knows? We don't know. But if you listen carefully, put it on again and listen to it over and over, you'll realize something. And that is that what she was really doing was whispering. She didn't want to be heard. She made the call surreptitiously. So that's why you don't hear her clearly. And why they have to fight to get the answer out of her. That makes perfect sense. And if you listen again, with what I'm also guiding you with, you'll see that what Shannan Gilbert did at all times was perfectly reasonable. If you start with the premise that she really was under a threat. If you believe Brewer and you believe Pack that there was no threat, then some of what Shannan did doesn't make sense. But most of it does anyway. And what is it that she did next? You hear Brewer showing up on the scene. Listen carefully. You hear Pack coming in. There's a struggle. We're not so sure, if you listen to the words of the people struggling, that she was merely struggling with Brewer. It does sound like there's another voice in there when you do the enhancement. Now, before I tell you about my enhancement, we found a company out in Ohio, a guy formerly from Long Island, a media guy, with a former FBI detective who did voice enhancements. So they did the transcript for us with the tape, and they did the voice enhancement, and their tape was pretty, they did a pretty nice job, and we were very proud of them. And we gave that to the police department. That's what the police department was relying on. But when I sat myself and listened to the tape again several times, I put it in my car, I listened to it over and over, and you match it up with the transcript, these guys they were missing a lot of beats there in their rendition. So it's not a perfect transcript by any stretch. So we found somebody else. And this guy was a rock singer, he does rock music enhancements and modifications, that kind of thing. His equipment was better. And we could hear much better this time than we heard the first time. And what do we hear? You'll hear when you listen to it for the first time, you'll hear sort of a, how do you call it? Not quite mumbling, but background noise that could be voices. And I've always assumed up until this enhancement that they were the noises in the 911 room. And so, no harm, no big deal there. But listen carefully, you'll see that the voices continue, if they're voices at all. When you get it enhanced, there are voices. And you can hear the word no. You can hear several other words as well, which tonight I'm not going to reveal to you. I'm going to challenge you to go back yourselves and listen to it as best you can with the best equipment you have. And listen to it over and over and over. I had to listen to it 4 times. I had people working on this with me, very nice group of women, and another type of version. Have you ever noticed that with sex crimes units in police departments, there are often many women in those departments for the good reasons that you could imagine? Did you notice that these are sex crimes we're dealing with, and not one woman on the force in that unit? Not one woman. Why? Did they just put up their wall? That made no sense to me. I digress. Right? But, and it's interesting because there are some who say when they brought the state police in, it was one woman who spent the time to go through the evidence over and over, time and time, and got it right. Interesting. But anyway, back to the tapes. Listen to it 4 times or 5 times, and you will hear words being spoken by people who are there. And they're either out on the deck of Brewer's house or inside in another room or upstairs. But that, Shannan, remember, she's got a small phone, and it's being tape recorded far away. So you're not going to get a perfect sound, but you're going to get the sound, and you're going to know that there were people there. They are there. Right? And then I'm going to challenge you to listen even more carefully to what word or words you're going to hear. I'm not going to tell you myself. I leave it to you. I haven't brought it to the police yet until I see that Ray Tierney and Rodney Harrison working together are ready to accept it. Okay? Then listen. You'll hear that Shannan is in a struggle because somebody, perhaps just Brewer, perhaps more than Brewer, is trying to pull her somewhere. Outside, get her out. Brewer's always told the story that he got out, he never had sex with her, and he left, and he knocked on Pac's door outside in the car and brought Pac in to get her out. That's his story. There's no evidence of that story. 0 evidence of that story. And he insisted publicly over and over again, and the police never made an arrest of this man, that he never had sex with Shannan. Why not? He said because she looked like a man. And she said to him, now then he later on changed that, he modified and said, she had said to him something like, have you ever been involved with or sex with a man or something like that? And that completely disgusted this wonderful man, this moral paragon. And he decided that he wasn't going to have sex with her. That's what he claimed originally. Now, if he is the John that did have sex or brought her for the purpose of having sex to his house, they cross state lines, that brings in the feds. All right? But more importantly, even in Suffolk County, the police can make an arrest for doing that. And they never arrested Brewer. When they knew why they had... Why wouldn't you do that? When you could arrest them and then roll them up, as they used to say. Right? Start asking, say, listen, if you talk to us, we'll help you out. You won't be charged. Or they have all kinds of techniques. They didn't use them on Brewer nor on Pac, who is a convicted human trafficker, trafficking people from Indonesia or Thailand, I forget which. And he got busted and went to federal prison for it. And here he is, trafficking Shannan. So what do you think happened that night? I'll tell you, a lot more happened than we know right now. But we know more happened. And so when she tries to get out, she does exactly what she's confused. She doesn't know what to do. And what would you do if you thought that there were men outside, or men and women, who knows, outside waiting to get you, and you had a reason to believe that, and you were inside? Do you stay inside and wait for them to come in? Or do you run right into their arms? A Sophie's choice, right? What does she do? The most rational thing. She runs. That makes more sense to me. And she does it keeping her phone on and her phone in hand. That makes perfect sense to me. So I won't bore you with every detail. We only have so much more time. But when she goes out, Brewer had claimed, oh, she fell down the stairs. Pack had claimed he had sat in the car, didn't know anything was going on. And then she ran by his car and just kept going. That's what he claimed. That can't be true. When you listen to the tape, listen to hear if she fell down the stairs. You will not hear that. But her earring is found on the ground outside the house, approximately near where the car would have been parked, if you believe Pack. One earring is there, big hoop earring. Those things don't just fall off because you fall down the stairs. That came off in a struggle. We know the earring was there because the police didn't locate it. The Shannan's sisters located it the following week when they went looking for her. And it matched up with the one that she had. So Shannan was clearly threatened. And she did clearly the right thing by saying over and over, they're trying to kill me, and went and tried to escape. And the blood-curdling scream, if you listen carefully, it sounds like there might be more than one voice there. If you hear just sort of a grunt of a voice besides hers, it may be another voice as well. It's hard to tell. But she runs. Pack could not have just been sitting in his car when that blood-curdling scream occurred, especially in that area where the sound carries. It's not possible. He's not telling you the truth about what happened. Then she keeps going, and you hear her knocking on doors, don't you? I think she knocks on 2 doors before she gets to Coletti's house. Could be over. That takes time. I walked that, we tried to jog that, and it's a bit of a run, that road. So where was Pack? If he saw the girl that he was there with bolting, he's got problems, doesn't he? What's one of the main problems he has? Money. How did he get paid? If she's got the money, how is he going to get paid? That's why he's there, to get the money. And he worked that night for an organization, a sex trafficking organization. We know that from his own testimony, where he said he had to go and leave and pick up money from another guy who was running the same thing, another guy running a girl, and he was going to take that money and have to deposit it to the organization he was working for in Queens. So he himself admits he was working for an organization. This wasn't just Brewer calling up and getting a trick with a pimp. That's just not the case. And so now she gets to Coletti's door, and now I'm about to reveal to you what hasn't been said. And you'll hear it clearly, even without enhancement, if you listen carefully. Shannan gets to Coletti's door. Coletti claims, and you can see him in videos now from the press when he seemed to really enjoy himself, former pitcher of the Pittsburgh Pirates, by the way. Also a man who enjoyed trafficking in fireworks and professionally. And his whole garage was filled with fireworks, and it exploded. And he had to have it rebuilt. Another story, we'll go down there. Coletti claims that she was yelling, "Help me, help me, help me, help me." And he also claims that when she knocked on his door, he invited her in, and she came in. And she stood there, and then he reached for the phone to call 911, and when she saw that, she bolted. Which, of course, if she did that, makes very little sense. She's the one who called 911. Why would she be running when he says, "I'm going to call the police"? Wouldn't she stay right there? But she runs away. Obviously, she's crazy. Obviously, she's going to now run into a marsh, right? That's their theory. Except when you listen to the tape. And what's inescapable in that tape is that Shannan goes up that staircase. You can hear it. Coletti claims what I told you he did, and then he claimed when she bolted, in one story, he said she ran right up the roadway, which would take you right by the gate. He's right by the gate. Okay. And never seen again. In another story, she left with Pack, and they were never seen again. In another story, She went under his boat in the front yard, hid, and then bolted across the roadway that came up alongside his house on the south side, and went across that roadway into the marsh over there, and then ran away, and went right in front of Pac's car. The man, one of the men she would have been running from. That's what's said. That story came later. It would make you believe that she's willing to run into marshes. Get it? Coletti didn't tell the truth either. He said to the Star Ledger reporter from New Jersey, North Bergen area, he said, ask me anything you want, but don't ask me to give up my friends. His best friend was Peter Hackett. When Shannan's bones were found, Hackett was found in his house. So, you will not hear Shannan ever saying, help me, help me, help me, help me. It never happened. You can hear the tape yourself. That was a lie. What he heard was the scream, maybe. And why was this old man up at 5 o'clock in the morning? Well, he claimed he was going to a car show upstate. That's why he was up, he said. But why do I ask you that question? Because of what happens next. And this is the new thing. She comes up to the door, knocks on the door, and Coletti answers, not as you would, normal person, say, is everything okay? What's wrong? Are you okay? You know, is something going on? Instead, he greets her with a very snide, almost obnoxious comment, like, you better watch out for yourself. You better help yourself, or something like that. You better watch out for yourself. In my business, when I deal with gangsters, you know, of the Italian brand, that's a threat. That's a very common threat that's used. And that's how he greeted her. And he did not invite her into the house. And she did not go in the house. And he did not call 911 at that time. Those were all lies. Instead, you hear her leaving. And then he calls 911. So the whole story is wrong. Then he told me that the very next thing he did, after he called, he hung up the phone and he at all times kept his eye on the gate. And he went to the gate and waited for the cops who came 40 minutes later, a single cop in a single car, who drove around a little bit and left. Coletti never managed to see Pac leave, even though he kept his vision on the gate. And even though he told other people that Pac left with Shannan and went in a different direction. When Canning testifies later on, Canning says 2 cops came because he was at Brennan's house. 2 cops drove up, one an African-American, one a white guy, and they never got out of their cars, even though Canning told them that he saw footprints of slippers in the mist on the deck of Mrs. Canning's house going toward the water. The 2 cops never bothered to investigate whether she was in the water. But that's what he said, he claimed. Happening to match the actual slippers she was wearing, sort of tie-up type of shoes that she was wearing that night. But behind the 2 cops, according to Canning, was Gus Coletti in his car. So Gus Coletti did not spin the right story. And there obviously are reasons for that. In other words, when Shannan gets to that door and turns and runs right away, there is a reason. And now I reveal it to you. Listen carefully to the tape. She says, she's out of breath. You. It's you. It's you. Either she knew Coletti already, or somebody who was standing there with Coletti. There's no escaping that conclusion. And she ran right away. Does that make sense? A lot more was going on here, ladies and gentlemen. A lot more. Peter Hackett was in charge of the gate where the cameras were, security guard. gate. He said that it was his mission to find Shannan. That's what he said. And he never gave the tapes to the police department. They were erased, allegedly, 18 days later. Never to be used. Same man said that within a week of Shannan's disappearance, he concluded that she was dead in the marsh. On the day that he called Shannan's mother, a day and a half later, to announce that he was Peter Hackett, a doctor who ran a home for wayward girls, she was trying to get into it, and he needed Mary's permission for this 24-year-old girl who didn't live at home. Needed her permission to enter the home. And she agreed to go in the home, but she left with her driver after he medicated her, and he's worried because she didn't return. That's what he tells the mother, who he's never met. And he called up in Ellenville, New York on that Monday, after the Saturday after she disappeared. And that same man, that same day, called the Ellenville Police Department to see what they had on Shannan. He called the Jersey City Police Department to see what they had on Shannan. And there he got a detective, a fine man named Detective Cesar Camacho. Cesar Camacho was a dyed-in-the-wool detective who was doing missing persons. And he did an excellent job chasing down Hackett. And he thought Hackett was his chief suspect right away. And Hackett told Camacho that Hackett was running a home for wayward girls. So it wasn't just Mary who said it. But there's one place that Peter Hackett did not call. Peter Hackett, the former surgeon, police surgeon of Suffolk County. You know, with the brass, nice tacks on his shoulder, right? The white shirt. The former surgeon never called the Suffolk County Police Department when he thought this girl was missing and it was his mission to find her. And when he assumed that she was dead in the marsh. And when he had a deck on the top of his house, so you could go up there, I went up there, I got up there, and you could see right into the marsh where she died, or was buried, or was left. He never went up there to look. And he never asked anybody else to do that, except to show you the callousness of the Suffolk County Police Department in this investigation, and how they really thought of Mary Gilbert and Shannan. When she was found, they brought Mary down in the rain from Ellenville and brought her up on, she had said Peter Hackett was the killer because she got that call, brought her up on Peter Hackett's deck to look down where her daughter was. That's what they did. And so Peter Hackett also didn't make another call. When Diaz, her boyfriend, and Pac, her driver, came looking for her on Monday morning, knocking on doors in Oak Beach, and there's a lot more to the story than we have time to go into. They came to Hackett somehow, depending on who you believe, and discussed what happened to Shannan. She was missing. Nobody thought she was dead. Yeah? And so Hackett said, okay, well, I have connections. I'm a big wheel in the police department. I'll get helicopters to come, and I'll get dogs. He said that on a Sunday. This is the day after she disappeared. And on Monday, sure enough, there were helicopters, and there were dogs looking for Shannan. And in that quest, here it is Monday, Peter Hackett called all those police departments just the day before, right? Called Mary Gilbert, and never once called Shannan Gilbert. Never called. It's like in Sherlock Holmes' story with the dog that didn't bark. He never called because he knew that she was already dead. There was no reason to call her. And when I asked him that question, and he was about to answer it, his lawyer interrupted the question and said, "Oh, of course she was dead, John," sarcastically. Prevented him from answering. So you get a flavor of the real story of Shannan Gilbert, the real story of the police investigation. That same investigation took place of the other poor young women who were left in the marsh as they were. The same police department was investigating them. I just think that God's will be done when he finally allowed Ray Tierney to get in there and Rodney Harrison to put together this task force to actually do something right. And they did. And we're looking to hope that they will now look, perhaps with your letters, your pressure, to reopen the Shannan Gilbert case and treat it like it is a murder. Overwhelmingly so. That's what we need. Why? And I'll finish with this and let you go, because I hope I must be over time a little. I'm good? Okay. I'll leave you with this, that you really need to do this, what I've just requested of you. Go home and watch yourself and do something about it. Flood the police department with letters. Flood the DA with letters. Because these girls, everybody says, well, they're human beings too. I get that. We all know that. And some human beings get treated better than others in life and afterlife. But I think you need to think of something else. And that is that these people, these girls, were little girls. And they are roped into the work they're doing by their circumstances, which weren't so good as they grew up. And they had dreams and naivete. And they were very sweet girls. And they were soft girls. And they were lonely loner girls from small towns. I tell you that for two reasons. First, because you got to believe in who they are. And secondly, because those are the girls that the sex trafficking organizations specifically look for to bring them into the system. Once with the advent of the computer, it was no longer walk the streets with a pimp. It now became a highly organized business, and it is. And I've investigated it myself. I have a case up in Buffalo as we speak that I've taken of a girl who was found upside down, frozen dead, a sex worker in a garbage can, and they ruled her death accidental. All right? And so I went up and helped that lady on her case. And the courts have denied her redress, even though we had 5 experts saying she was murdered. And they said, well, it's too late to bring the case. She died in 2009. Mr. Ray, you came in here in 2021, too late. So we're not going to let you do it. She turns out to have been a co-worker with Melissa Barthélemy, who was one of the girls of the 4. Okay? And they both went to California together to train. They actually bring you to training by what they call bottom girls, to train them to serve as Hollywood figures. And then flew back. Shannan, by the way, also went to California within just a few weeks before her death. They're wrapped up in the organization. They're not alone. And they look for these kind of kids to bring them in because they're easy, they're targets. And they usually have the quality they look for of loyalty. These girls were very loyal. Jessica Taylor, Shannan Gilbert, who I can speak for, they were very loyal to their families. Generous, loyal. Very sad, very unhappy girls. But they were little children too. And something went wrong. So they deserve what I finish with. They deserve not the word justice. The word justice is a word that's a legal word. And it has a certain hardness to it, doesn't it? It would bring justice. But they deserve mercy. Mercy. They are still alive, every one of them. If you don't believe in the soul, you only believe in the body, what are we doing? Why waste our time? But if you believe they had souls, and they do, those souls are alive. They're not necessarily here, but they're alive. Their bodies are gone, that's all. Their souls are unrequited, and they need mercy. They need the mercy of finality and truth, which then results in human justice. But it's mercy that I focus on, for them and their families, If you can give that and help, you will help me in my work. Thank you.